Depois o Carlos e depois o... Está bem. Podemos começar? Então,
Good morning to everyone. My name is Margarida Tomé, and I'm here in this conference with two functions. I'm listening to the conference because I'm a forester and I like this topic very much, but I'm here also in representation of the president of ISA that apologizes for not being able to be here. So in this function, I just want to welcome you and to tell you that ISA is very happy to support this conference. This is a very important topic. We all know that we have to move from the management of individual stands and to think broader if we want to solve the problems of the Portuguese forest. The Portuguese forest is suffering from many risks, and some of them are due to lack of management. Some people say poor management, but I would say that usually the stands that I know that are managed, they are not poorly managed, they are reasonably well managed. The problem is no management at all. And so this type of initiatives, like the one in the Bio Ecosis Project that tackled the forest management and forest planning at a landscape scale and also on a strong interaction with stakeholders, because this is also very important. Most of our problems are not technical. We forests, we are very good. We know how to solve the problem. The problem is how to implement it, how to deal with our private landowners that are quite small. Some are interested in the management, but most of them, that's not the case. So I think that ISA is very happy to welcome you, and let's start our conference.
Thank you, Margarida. So, Carlos.
Good morning, everyone. I'm not very good in my voice, but I will do my best. First of all, I want to thanks to ISA, to Professor José Guilherme Borges for the invitation of Forestwise to be here to make part of this organization. And I'm representing this institution, Forestwise, that is a quite new organization. We have now. We are now 2 years old in next February, and this collab, this laboratory collaborative of fire and forest integrated management comes up because the private sector as well as the universities feel that there was a gap that we must fill it. And then this Forestwise was created after these big fires from 2017, and it represents this joint venture between private companies, universities, and public sector. And nowadays we are leading several big projects in Portugal. We are also working together with the universities, our 6 universities, as well with our 7 forest and energy companies. This project that we are now in the final conference is for us very, very important because, as Professor Margarida told us, it deals with the management, the good practices of this management and how to take the stakeholders together with the knowledge. For me personally, it's a very important step because I'm also a landowner, and I feel that this kind of information is not achieving the final target. So this kind of projects are really important in this moment. And nowadays we are, I think, in a very good time to apply this kind of information. As we know, the strategy of forest management is changing after 2017, changing, and not only because of the recovery and the resilient plans, but also other funding sources will come very soon, and we have the opportunity to put in practice some of the results of this project. So I think this project and the end of this project comes in the right time because we have the opportunity very soon to apply most of these results. So once again, thank you very much, José, for the invitation of ForestWise. I will be here during all day, and I want, of course, to participate in the discussion, even without voice. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Margarida and Carlos, for this opening address on behalf of the School of Agriculture, ISA, and Forest Research Center, and also of the ForestWise Collab. And you don't hear? Okay, so thank you again, Margarida and Carlos, for this opening address on behalf of the School of Agriculture and the Forest Research Center of the University of Lisbon, the ForestWise Collab. I would like to welcome you all present here in ISA and all of you who are attending online on behalf of the organizing committee of the conference that includes both representatives from ISA and representatives from ForestWise. We have what we think is a very interesting program with the talks by colleagues from BOKU in Austria, from the University of Munich, Thomas Nock in Munich in Germany, our colleague Shandar Toth at University of Washington in the US, our colleague Jens Altrup from INRE in France, and Jordy Garcia Gonzalo from CTFC in Spain, as well as talks by colleagues that have been involved deeply in these research projects that provide the framework for this conference, the Bio Ecosis and the Modifier project. So I would like to welcome you all again on behalf of this committee, and we'll be focusing on also on the demonstration of specific tools that encapsulate the models and research that has been conducted in the framework of these projects. And this kind of leads to that fulfillment of the objective that Margarida and Carlos talk, which is the implementation. How to bridge the gap between science and practice, how to take what we develop here in our research centers to the forest owners, to try to enhance the contribution of the forest sector to the Portuguese and international economies. So I will then start by making a presentation, a very brief presentation about the projects that provide the background and for the research developed that will be presenting here. So these projects, the Bioecosys Modifier projects, are national projects funded by the Portuguese Science Foundation. And there is also an international project, an IRANET Forest Value IRANET project that also provides the background for the international cooperation targeting the development of this research and these tools. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the rationale. Why are we developing this research? Then I'll make a specific reference to the projects that provided the framework and the support for its development. I'll refer briefly to the Living Lab. Remember, we are targeting the implementation of the tools we are conducting research. I will outline the research developed, and that's something that will be detailed later in the talks in the following sessions. So let's start with the rationale. So we know that we do need to promote and strengthen landscape level management planning. We know that this is key to the sustainability of forest management and to the provision of ecosystem services. We know that if we focus on a stand level scale, for example, if we have a forest owner that develops management of his property and he does it very well, nevertheless, if his or her neighbors don't, it's very likely that the accumulation of fuel in the neighboring properties may lead to wildfires that will spread to that property. So we do need a landscape level perspective if we target wildfire protection and the provision of other ecosystem services, biodiversity and others. So this is further highlighted by the context in which forest management takes place. We deal with landscapes that are fragmented, where most property is private and small scale. So we do need to engage the forest owners if we do want to promote that landscape level perspective that is key to the sustainability of the resources. So this research acknowledges the need for a landscape level perspective and tries to answer three main questions. The first, of course, is to think about ways that may help us estimate the impact of management options on the provision of ecosystem services. We do need to answer this question if we want to develop landscape level management that may target the provision of ecosystem services. Second question, we are dealing with landscapes where we have several owners, several decision makers. We do need tools that may help promote negotiation, consensus building, and develop joint management plans. And finally, last but not the least, we do need tools that may attract payments for those ecosystem services that are not traded in the market, because otherwise we don't have a foundation that may promote that landscape level management approach. And this is key to provide ecosystem services, and providing them and getting payments for them is instrumental for the development of these landscape level management approaches. We do need that pillar, those payments, in order to do it. So this is the rationale for the research developed. And we have developed in the framework of 3 projects that support the organization of this conference, and research results of which we'll be talking about in the following sessions. The first one is the Bio Ecosis Project that's coordinated by ISA, and it involves several national institutions, Catholic University in Porto, Leiria, Faculdade de Ciências in Lisbon, and that has as stakeholders the Forest Owners Association in Val de Sousa, and also a consultation panel that includes colleagues from Penn State and the University of Washington, namely Chandra Toth will be joining us later in this conference. We are also presenting results and development research in the framework of the International Cooperation Project, which is the Noble Project, focus on the development of these tools and on ways and approaches to attract payments, business models for non-market ecosystem services. So we'll be having here presentations by the leader of that project, our colleague Harald Vassig from Boku in Austria, Jens Altrup from INRE in France, Thomas Nock from University of Munich in Germany, and Jordy will be also presenting research developed in the framework of this project in Spain in CTFC. And finally, there is also another national project, the Modifier project, coordinated by our colleague here in ISA, Suzette Marques, who focus on the specific issue of wildfire management and how to integrate wildfire issues in forest ecosystem management planning at this landscape level. Okay, so I'll go very briefly now over the Living Lab. We want to bridge the gap between science and practice. So we are tying all our research to a landscape that in Val de Sousa. It encompasses 2 joint management zones, zonas de intervenção florestal in Portuguese, that involve over 350 forest owners, an area that's managed by a Forest Owners Association, Associação Florestal Val de Sousa, and it's a landscape that's very interesting for developing this research and for testing, developing, and demonstrating the tools we'll be talking about later in this conference. So what about the 3 main questions to address this issue of landscape level management planning? Remember, the first one, of course, is if we want to develop landscape level management plans, we do need to know how to estimate the impact of what we do on that provision. And here we'll have talks that will focus on the information, the tools, the models that have been developed or adjusted, updated, in order to estimate the impact of those management options on the provision of biodiversity, wildfire protection, carbon, wood, soil erosion, wildfire resistance. Another important issue, because we are dealing with those fragmented landscapes with several decision makers, several owners, is to understand the perspectives, how they see it, what are their preferences. And we'll be talking here about research developed in the framework of dissertations, projects. Marlene Marx here present contributed very interesting to this research on how to capture those preferences, how to understand or identify the objectives of the forest owners and decision makers. So basically, when we were answering or addressing the first question, we were dealing mostly with ecological issues, technical issues. Here we are dealing with social issues, preferences, objectives. And we bring together, and we'll be talking about that social perspective or economic perspective with ecological perspective using specific tools we'll be demonstrating in our afternoon session to enable the forest owners to explore plans, to explore trade-offs, to provide information about what is the impact, what do alternative plans contribute to the provision of different bundles of ecosystem services. And finally, we'll be addressing a third question, and there will be talks and demonstrations here by our team in Catholic University that has been focusing on this aspect, how to attract payments for those ecosystem services. We have several plans. We know what's the impact of those management plans on the provision of ecosystem services, how to attract payments for them. And we'll be demonstrating here ways or research to try to address this third question. I would like also to refer to the support and sponsoring by the International Union of Forest Research Organizations. So there are 2 units sponsoring this conference. The Information Management Information Technologies Group, which is coordinated by Harald Vasik from Boku in Austria, and the unit Sustainable Forest Management Scheduling that I coordinate. And this meeting is one in a long stream of meetings that we have been promoting and developing worldwide to disseminate and promote research in this area of landscape level management planning. And so with this last slide, I welcome you again to the conference. I wish you a very interesting participation in both the oral presentation and demonstration sessions. And I would leave now the floor and for the next session, where we have presentations by our colleagues from Boku, Harald Vasik, who was the coordinator of the novel project, and also by our colleague Thomas Nock from the Technical University in Munich. They will be focusing on tools and methods for supporting forest management to provide this wide range of ecosystem services. That's a talk by Harald. And Thomas will be focusing on the potential of robust optimization techniques. And that's a topic that we have been working in the framework of Novel, and hopefully we'll have results of the cooperation between our institutions and the Novel institutions and applications to the living labs in the Novel project of these very interesting and potential techniques. Okay, so thank you again, welcome you, and I have my best wishes for your participation in this conference. So Harold, floor. Thank you.
Yes, many thanks, Jose, for giving the opportunity to give now a talk at the conference, and many thanks also for the kind invitation and introduction, and also for making it possible to give my talk now in this hybrid format at the conference. Yeah, would love to be with you in this one, especially at the times, and sharing also our experiences of the projects. And yeah, I would like to focus now a little bit on a broader perspective on the 3 research questions that you have nicely laid out. What is somehow of interest in forest management planning, in providing forest ecosystem services, and focusing on different tools, methods and techniques that are used in forest management planning. So just to confirm, so you can see the slides also at the conference. Okay, great. So the outline of my talk is focusing on some aspects that I would see as a key aspect in facilitating decision support in forest management. And I will then provide 3 practical examples from our research about selecting appropriate planning methods, designing decision support systems, and also supporting knowledge transfer, where all 3 aspects I would propose as a very key aspect in decision support in forest management. So when we talk about ecosystem services in forest management planning, we have this multitude of services that are of interest for stakeholders, for forest managers, for the general public. And depending whether we are in the Mediterranean ecosystems, whether we are in Central Europe or in boreal ecosystems, we have different setting of ecosystem services that are relevant for the people. And the demand and the supply is also very different in that context. And we have learned from the past that these demands have stimulated also the development of decision support approaches, tools, and techniques. So there was the need for improved timber production. There was the need for maintaining biodiversity, ensuring multifunctionality and sustainable forest management. So all these kind of issues have facilitated also the development of decision support tools and techniques, whether these are now ecosystem models, optimization techniques, or multi-criteria analysis techniques. So we have a huge multitude of methods and techniques that are designed to support forest management planning. And what we see now, this increasing demands that we see in the last decade, where we have now a new provision of ecosystem services. They also require extended ecosystem models. We are discussing also the functional role of biodiversity and how we design policy support systems in that context. We have non-wood timber products, which require improved growth and yield models to predict the quantity of non-wood timber products. We have also a lot of biotic and abiotic disturbances. Wildfire was already mentioned in the introduction, and we need to integrate these disturbance agents in our models, in our tools. We have to think about adaptation and mitigation in the whole cycle, and we have also to think how we can support these increasing policy regulations, where we have a large set of data, where we think about life cycle assessments and all these kind of different tools. So facilitating somehow decision support in forest management for ecosystem services, I would propose that we need a good mixture of three elements. So on the one hand, it's competence, where we have to focus on knowledge and skills. We have to focus on commitment, where I would say it's very important that the group of stakeholders, decision makers, scientists who are involved in such kind of decision support techniques are committed to the task. And we have to focus also on communication, where all the people that are involved are somehow supporting this process and exchange of information. And why I would like to stress this mix now of competence, commitment, and communication, maybe just some quotes from scientific literature. When we focus on competence, it's always about selecting the right planning procedure. We need skilled leaders. We need also the proper selection of information. We have to select the proper methods and tools. We have to integrate this diversity of knowledge in the planning process. And we have also to link the expertise of scientists and laymen in a meaningful manner. And that's quite a challenge. When we focus on commitment, we have seen that it's very important to build trust, confidence among the people who are involved in the decision support. We have to create an environment which allows also that people are working towards the final objectives, that we mobilize these resources without having somehow an expectation about the outcome. And there's also known from literature that even when we have a high low level of conflict or workload, that we achieve even better results in the planning procedure. But overall, there's a need for a good plan of recommendations that focus on this planning. So commitment, very important in that. And the third element, communication, is that it facilitates the whole process. So a shared understanding improves the whole planning. We have to tailor our communication activities in a way that we have, on the one hand, face-to-face communication. We have, on the other hand, a dialogue between the different stakeholders. And we need those relevant tools, instruments, techniques that are available nowadays, which support this shared understanding among the people involved in the planning process. So overall, these three elements, competence, communication, and commitment, are very important in decision support. And I would like to bring now three examples to highlight a little bit these aspects. On the one hand, competence, as I said, is needed in order to select the appropriate methods and techniques. So especially when we think about collaborative planning in natural resource management. We have to consider three aspects in planning and decision making. On the one hand, it's problem identification. The second step is problem modeling. And the third step is problem solving. And for each of those steps in planning and decision making, there are different techniques available that can help to support the planning process. On the one hand, in problem identification, we need to gather the right information to understand the problem. We have to structure it. In problem modeling, we try to bring up the different options that can be set in place to provide ecosystem services to general public or to people who have a demand for that. And in problem solving, we are interested then in prioritizing the different alternative management options in order to find the best management plans for a given situation. In a study, we have evaluated different collaborative planning methods. So there's a multitude of methods available. And in this study, we have done several case studies with stakeholders, and we screened the methods according to their potential to support collaborative planning. And what was interesting in our study was that these evaluated methods, they have a different potential to support all these aspects that are seen important in forest management planning. So on the one hand, we can see on the top, most of the techniques allow to include qualitative information. They try to increase transparency in the planning process. And they also are designed in a way to gather different interests and produce understandable documents. And on the other hand, we can see there's quite a lack of methods that help us to explore and handle uncertainty. And sometimes these methods are also very time-consuming because they take a lot of time and not so many stakeholders can be involved. So we have on the one hand advantages and the other hand also disadvantages with these techniques. And when we screen these over 40 different methods, we can see that some methods are better in problem solving and some methods are better in problem modeling and some methods are better in problem identification. So there's not one method that maybe fits all these different aspects in one technique. And when we zoom a little bit in, it was interesting to find out that, for instance, the EWOT technique, this is a very familiar technique which allows us to include experience and tacit knowledge, supports quantitative analysis, was seen as very powerful in that context. Or planning for real as another technique, which can be nicely linked also with participatory GIS tools, allows a better involvement of local people in that context. Or CATVO as another example. It's very powerful tool in structuring decision problems, getting to a better understanding of a complex situation and involving all the different actors from different perspectives. Or open space is a very good tool when you would like to engage various stakeholders from different disciplines and helps to get a common understanding of the problem. Or World Cafe, a very well-known technique which allows collaborative learning in large groups. So summarizing on this first example about evaluation of different methods and tools, it's very important to list the demands of the involved stakeholders in the planning process. So what are their requirements in that context? On the other hand, we have also seen that increasing transparency, producing understandable documents, also qualitative information have been seen as highly relevant in these case studies, that these are somehow key criteria for the methods to be selected. And on the other hand, we have learned that methods that are very much better performing under problem modeling than in problem identification or problem structure. But very often we know that a combination of different methods is always the best, bringing them in a sequence in order to support a broader planning approach. Coming now to the second example, commitment by stakeholders, forest management and scientists. To my understanding, this commitment is very much needed in order to have the successful development and design of decision support tools. We have made such an experience with a web-based decision support tool called Glimpchalp with a kind of multitude of different stakeholders who have strongly committed themselves to this idea. The background of this decision support tool is related to climate change and forest management. So we know that through climate change, a lot of impacts are caused regarding disturbances, regarding the growth and yield, the regeneration of plants. And this kind of impacts of climate change are causing a lot of challenges also for the manager who try to adapt forest management concepts in the dealing with these different disturbances and changing growth and regeneration patterns in order to provide these products and ecosystem services that we're interested. So we have a lot of uncertainty involved, we have a lot of complexity involved, and selecting the best management approach in this context is really a big challenge, especially in the context when we would like to provide support to decision makers. So that's why we set up a process of developing a tool together with the forest advisory services in order to ask questions. How should this consultation process be supported? How is the look of the software? What kind of data we need? What kind of models we need? And how should then the final look and feel of the software be to define these interfaces, the communication, and so on and so on. Testing for validity and sensitivity. And the final outcome of this process was that we identified these key steps. So first, there's a requirement for identifying site and stand characteristics of this forest management unit in a very easy way. So we need an easy and a low barrier for the forest owners to get this information, specifying site information, having easy accessible images and wizards which guide the forest owner to this process in identifying the current stand and site conditions. The second step was then to select the best treatment alternatives in that context. So we had a list of indicators for ecosystem services that can be used in that context, and the forest owner can select the best management options which are appropriate for fulfilling these different ecosystem services in that context. There was also the need to have a verbal and graphical description of the stand treatment procedures to demonstrate how these management regimes should be implemented. And finally, there was then an assessment, an overall assessment of these ecosystem service indicators by very easy to understandable means, by arrows, by graphs, which are easy to communicate. Also, this change of the indicators over time. And there were several opportunities included in the tool, which should allow a comparison of these management options. On the one hand, doing a comparison between the options, or also providing a comparison between different time periods. So again, a lot of flexibility for the forest owner to make comparison between these different management tools. And this then somehow led to a very strong commitment to the use of this tool. So having a simple access for the users with advanced web technologies, easy to learn, easy to use, and limited data investigation in the field. This also improved the usability of the tools. So on the one hand, that there is no need for huge data investigation in the field. And the visualization, this comprehensive visualization of a very complex topic, focusing on climate change and adaptation forest management, and providing means for comparing the alternatives in various forms, was also very important to increase the commitment of the people in using the tool. On the other hand, there were also some drawbacks because providing a best guess for the input data is very tricky, and having somehow a low flexibility because when you fix everything in advance, so then the number of alternatives is fixed, the indicators are fixed, there are limited options to identify preference information. So you have also quite some limitations when you would like to design the tool, which is strongly related on the demands of the decision makers. The third example that I would like to focus on is on communication, which is very relevant for the knowledge transfer between science, policymakers, and forest management. And for that example, I would like to highlight a web platform that we have developed for a new project called Fundif Europe, focusing on the functional significance of biodiversity. What was the idea or the vision of this knowledge transfer platform? On the one hand, we have the researchers who supply the various research results in their daily activities through publications, through conferences, workshops, seminars. On the other hand, we have the forest managers who have a certain demand on this information. So maybe they raise a quest in an online forum, or they have during a workshop, or through media, or through some kind of meetings, they have an interest. And the key question that we would like to tackle is, does tree species mixture really matter in the provision of ecosystem services? Does it make a difference to have a tree species mixture? So a very simple question, but you can somehow try to address this question from different perspectives. And the research within Fundif Europe tried to answer these questions through various forms. So there are two different perspectives on the knowledge transfer. On the one hand, there is the push strategy, where the scientists are somehow offering these knowledge elements, and they try to make it attractive for stakeholders to use this information. On the other hand, you could also focus on the pull strategy, where the stakeholder requests some kind of knowledge. So they discuss an issue and they would like to have an answer on this issue. The scientists should then provide the stakeholder through different means an answer on this question. So these are these two different perspectives. And the way of how this was now implemented in our platform is also focusing on these different aspects. On the one hand, there were designed different knowledge elements. We had publications, maps, some kind of vocabularies, videos, and so on. So different kind of ways of transforming the information on does tree species mixture really matter in the provision of ecosystem services. And when we zoom now in to one of these examples of a knowledge element, each of these knowledge elements was designed in a particular way to serve this purpose of knowledge transfer. So on the one hand, there was always a title, we had a body of information, there were some videos, some images included, and there were also a glossary of terms where the user can nicely search for these terms, get a better definition of the terms, and the whole information is automatically tagged by these terms. So which allows then a very standardized use of this information. Each knowledge element was also linked with a location. There was then somehow the intended reader had to be displayed so that it's clear who should be addressed by this knowledge information. And we have also focused on different tags or keywords that you identify these knowledge elements in the platform. And for each of these knowledge elements, the hypothesis and also the research questions had to be defined. So this allows then in a structured way, a definition of each of these knowledge information. You can link them publications, you can link them presentations, videos, whatever, to each of these knowledge elements in order to support the knowledge transfer. And as I said, there were also some semantic search facilities included in the knowledge base, which should allow the users to retrieve the information in a very easy way. So for instance, when you take now these examples of primary production, so you can see this primary production as an ecosystem service, and you have a definition. It's the assimilation or accumulation of energy and nutrients by organism, according to Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report. But maybe the people use a different term in when they are interested in primary production. So that's why there are then synonyms defined. There are then broader terms and narrower terms defined, which allow you to retrieve the appropriate information which term you're using, whether you're using now primary production or maybe timber production or any kind of other term for this supporting service. So this third example on communication now tells us that the technology has to follow the functionality and the needs of the involved scientists and forest managers and policymakers. It's very challenging to focus on such a pull strategy because it has to facilitate it on the one hand by the scientists, and it needs also a strong commitment by the scientists to support this knowledge transfer. Like, just think about squeezing the research that you have done now for 3 or 4 years in a short video statement of 2 minutes. This is a very demanding job, and it's not something that we do on a daily basis. also finding a common language and addressing somehow the regional stakeholders in their native language. This is almost impossible when you do this on a new level. So you have to somehow develop then some search facilities that can narrow down this information to the layman's knowledge on the regional level. And last but not least, sustaining and the maintenance of such a platform after project life is very challenging. This is not only true for knowledge transfer, but this is generally true for many of these European projects. So coming now to some general conclusions on my talk, when we talk on competence, on commitment and communication. So what is somehow what we can conclude on these 3 examples? The first aspects, when I made this example about the methods and techniques that can be applied in problem identification, problem modeling, and problem solving, we have to be aware that there's really an important need for a competent selection of the right method. Because like this classical saying, when you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is very true for many of us, because we always tend to use those methods, or we also tend to use those techniques that we are familiar with, because we know about the challenges, we know about the advantages, and then we try to apply it to a different context. But sometimes maybe it's very important to somehow change the overall setting and use a different method, a different technique, or also a different combination of these techniques in order to reduce the complexity, to raise awareness, or to support this transfer and innovation in problem solving. So that's a very key aspect. So choosing from this plenty of methods and techniques and using the right techniques for the different contexts. Second example, when I was talking about commitment and using decision support tools. In a very interesting work by Hartefeld, it was nicely laid out that we have a huge challenge between simplicity and complexity in designing decision support tools. So the user interaction and the communication with the end user is very challenging in designing decision support systems. He has proposed that these 3 different aspects of play, meaning, and reality are key in designing such kind of tools. And when we focus now on the meaning, so that how we can really make the tools in a way that they are meaningful to the end users. So the more complex it will be to make them maybe interesting or joyful to play with and to use them in the different contexts. And on the other hand, when we focus very strong on the reality aspect, so then we are maybe designing very complex systems which are very close to the reality, and they also can help to transport the information in a very well manner. But again, it will be very complex to use these tools in a setting with decision makers. So that's why there are then several dilemmas that are to be identified in the interplay between this meaning, the play, and the reality factor. And this is then somehow when you design a tool, whether you focus more on the meaning, more on the reality, or more on the play aspect, this will then lead to different dilemmas, because you're not always able to address all these aspects in the same manner in order to make a successful decision support tool in that context. And maybe the third aspect when it comes to communication and also to commitment is that we have to focus on ways to design these tools in a very easy way, which allows us to make use of these different knowledge types, of these different methods, of these different tools. And the toolbox approach might be a very useful approach to address all these different needs. Because with this toolbox approach, we are able to address display, the meaning and reality factor. We can use the tools for a specific context, which are tailored for the different planning situations. we can target the tools to different users. They might make use of the knowledge for different contexts. And we can have a very low barrier when we do this in a web-based manner. So that's somehow maybe a way to overcome these problems by saying that one tool has to fulfill all these different demands. I would propose there's even the need to have this kind of toolbox where you have all these different tools available and you use the right methods and tools in the different contexts in order to meet these different demands on the overall manner. So thanks for your attention and listening to my talk. I hope that, I could somehow address some of these aspects that Jose was mentioning at the very beginning on this research on collaborative planning issues, providing some services and using the right tools and techniques in forest management planning. Thanks for your interest.
So thank you, Harold, and for your interesting presentation. And I will give the floor now to Thomas. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. Many thanks to the organizers that I have the chance to give this presentation here. The topic is potential and limitations of robust optimization of multiple objectives in forest management. So my group learned a lot about this robust optimization technique while working in the tropics on the optimum allocation of land to different land use types. And we now try to further develop these methods, applying them also to forest and forest management, for example, in Europe, considering multiple objectives. So what is the background? The motivation to use robust optimization techniques is uncertainty. Because we always do not know what decisions, what contributions different decisions can make to our objectives in the future. So we often face this uncertainty. I will report on constructing uncertainty spaces, which is a technique to integrate the uncertainty in the optimization. I will show how the technique can be extended to consider multiple objectives, and then I will present forestry examples. But also, as the title says, I will discuss limitations and have some conclusions. So the question is always, which future state which we anticipate shall we consider in our robust optimizations? Questions are, what is the potential of robust optimization, and also limitations and future challenges? So some few words about uncertainty. So there are several concepts about uncertainty which provide kind of a continuum between we know everything, that is determinism, and we are ignorant, here even ignoring that we don't know. So this transition is, we could have a clear enough future where we have, for example, point estimates and some confidence intervals. So then we talk usually about a risky situation when we have probabilities for future states of nature. But if it gets worse, then we just know that we have multiple futures, but we don't know how likely the futures are. So there is only a known range of outcomes and a known range of weights, but we cannot make priorities what is more likely to happen. And finally, there is an unknown future. This is really a very tricky situation that we just know that we don't know. And this robust optimization technique we work with considers multiple futures without any weighting. So also integrating an aspect of this level 4 uncertainty. So we consider that always many things can happen, and we just construct the possibilities for the future and consider plausible futures simultaneously. We do not use any weights, neither for specific future states of nature nor for the objectives, because we argue that the objectives of future generations are yet also unknown. Therefore, we apply no weights, but we could, of course. So our idea of this robust optimization is to support multiple function forestry by integrating ecological indicators into the robust optimization of an optimal area allocation. For example, we use also carbon storage as an additional objective. And then more technically, we just somehow kick out the common objective functions, which we know from standard linear programming approaches, and we replace the objective function by numerous constraints, and each of the constraints would represent a different possible future. So how could such constraint look like? This is a sum of what we can achieve by differently allocating area to decision options. And the contribution of such a decision option, just planting a specific tree species to an objective of a decision maker, is represented by a coefficient, maybe the amount of carbon stored. And we can allocate a specific area fraction to a decision, for example, planting beech or planting eucalyptus or whatsoever. And we would like to have always, so this is the area allocated, and we would like to have always a very good result. And we can maybe identify some ideal results which we could achieve in the best situation. But under uncertainty, of course, it is not possible for all states of nature to achieve this maximum or maximally desired outcome. So that means we must make compromises, and we must allow for deviations from this maximum, and the deviations are characterized by a beta factor. So we have to relax the constraint so that it is feasible for a lot of scenarios. These scenarios are represented here. So we want to have that this constraint is fulfilled for a number of objectives and a number of uncertainty scenarios. We use here a normalization factor so that we can compare all the scenarios. So this is, of course, a bit theoretical and technical. How can we construct now uncertainty spaces to have the parameters for all the numerous constraints? So in the simplest case, we work with so-called box uncertainties, which I would like to demonstrate with 3 decision options. We can either go for Norway spruce, we can go for European beech, or we can go for silver fir. And the indicator I use here is the land rent. So what is the profitability of planting Norway spruce or beech or silver fir? And now we can imagine that there are several combinations of these land rents. Starting point is here that the land rents are for the different species at the maximum for all the species at the same time. So that is most optimistic. But it could also be that for the silver fir, for example, the land rent is not optimistic, it is pessimistic, but for Norway spruce and European beech, it is still optimistic. Or maybe it is only for the Norway spruce pessimistic, but for the other species optimistic. So in sum, we have 8 combinations. So it could also be that for all 3 decisions, we have a pessimistic outcome. And now we assume that the land rent can be anywhere in these boxes. And we make sure that our solutions are then valid for any combinations of the coefficients of the land rents included in the boxes. And we can consider differently sized boxes, of course, to represent higher or lower uncertainty. So in this case, we would have to consider the corner points of the boxes, 8 scenarios. So 8 constraints would be enough to consider the corner points of the boxes, which would include all the variation of the coefficients in the box. If I have more options, then I need more constraints, of course. So if we are more optimistic, we just ignore the corner points, which are extreme combinations, and we assume that we have ellipses, including the variation, possible covariation of the coefficients. So that is a little bit the background. Now we can extend this more or less easily to multiple objectives. So in the slide before, we considered only one objective, that was profitability. So, but we could also consider here with an example of the land allocation in the tropics, the net present value for different levels of discount rates. We could consider labor demand, payback periods also for different levels of time preferences. And I mentioned already that we normalize all these achievement levels, which we can achieve for different allocations of land. Here's the land allocation. In the initial situation, we have 50% natural forest, a little bit pasture, and also abandoned lands. And this composition leads then to a landscape level achievement, which is scaled between 0 and 100%. 100% is maximum, 0 is the minimum. We see that under uncertainty, we have a variation. And now the aim is that we reallocate the land to bring the most pessimistic achievement level, the minimum, as high as possible. So we want to move up these pessimistic results by improving the land allocation. So the Euclidean distances are considered when we have ellipses and not boxes. So when we now optimize, then we see that the landowners would integrate also alternative land use options, for example, plantations, also recultivation of abandoned lands in the direction of intense pasture management, for example. In the tropics, we would see also new deforestation and a reduction of the natural forest, which would move up then the minimum achievement level among all these indicators to higher level, to 40%, compared to being only 20% in the original situation. So that is the principal idea, and we can extend this to numerous indicators. We can now also, once we have a solution, by using Monte Carlo simulations, we can show that it is really robust. We have done this for the example I have presented before. You see the minimum achievement level is 40%, and with random input coefficients drawn from the boxes, we see that it is always at least 40% or even better. So we can prove that the solution is really robust under future uncertainty. So here are some example studies. Team members have applied this to Chilean forestry, to agroforestry. Also, they use different input data, for example, expert opinions or cost-benefit related data, which can form the information which we can use to feed our system. Now, an example, during the Nobel project, we have transferred this multiple robust optimization concept to forestry examples, but here that's a limitation. It is only stand level consideration. So to check whether the model really works, we have first ignored the robustness. So any uncertainties were out, and also tree species interactions. And then our model reproduces the standard clear felling system, which is applied all over the world. That is a pure spruce forest, and the rotation is 70 years. So in Germany, we always have a little bit longer rotations compared to other places in the world. So what is the result? The profitability of this type of management, so all cash flows discounted to the present, is indicated here. It's around 10,000 euro per hectare, 1 euro per square meter. Land rent is 140. The diversity of the age structure is 0 because I have only one age class and only one species. Cash flows are 18,000 and carbon stored is 48 tons per hectare. The difference between the best and the worst outcome is 60%. So we have quite a large volatility in the results. So now, what is the result of the optimization? When we now optimize, bringing the worst cases as high as possible, then we get endogenously a different solution. We obtain a mixed forest. This mixed forest is dominated by conifers, fir and spruce, but consists also of an admixture of a broadleaf, that is beech. We see it does not end with a clear cut, so it's a continuous cover forestry which we obtain here. We see that in the most optimistic scenario, we have a little insurance premium to pay. It's 9%. The most optimistic outcome is 9% less than the most optimistic outcome of the monoculture. But we have a lot of scenarios in which this system is more profitable than the other system. We see that the Shannon diversity has increased. Higher Shannon diversity level is a more heterogeneous forest. We see also that as a positive externality, this system, although only economics are considered, has more carbon than the monoculture system. It's 40% more carbon. In the case before, we had only 46 tons of carbon. And the difference between the most optimistic and most pessimistic scenarios is also much improved. It's not 60%, it is only 9%, so the solution is more robust. Now, having one objective more, carbon is now also important. What happens then? So if we consider carbon as a second objective function, we see immediately that the proportion of the broadleaf species is increasing, and we accumulate more standing timber to have a higher density of carbon per hectare. And this has, of course, consequences for the indicators. So the profitability decreases by 27%, and the soil rent is 34 euros per hectare and year less. Cash flows are also less, but we have 4 tons more carbon. The difference between optimistic and pessimistic gets a bit larger, but that is not significant. So we see this also with the timber harvested. So if we have only economic objectives, we see here on the y-axis the level of timber harvested. We see that we have more or less continuous or increasing timber harvests, where the maximum of the timber harvest in the economic situation is with an age of 90, while for more carbon, we postpone all our harvests, which means the risk is also increasing because we have survival probabilities included in the model. We can now compute a cost. This cost for 1 ton of carbon is extremely high. I was really surprised because I don't think that high prices for 1 ton more carbon are really discussed already. When we consider the CO2 fixed, for CO2, we would have to demand, the forest owner would have to demand 155 euros to compensate for the higher risk and also the loss in soil expectation value. So this is caused because we have less conifers and we postpone the harvests, which reduces the resistance. So I found this a quite interesting result. We have now, of course, also a very good collaboration with the colleagues from ESA, and they provided us also with coefficients for Portuguese forests. We have coefficients for maritime pine, for chestnut, for eucalyptus, and we can see when we consider here also carbon as an objective that we can enhance the wood carbon by 50%. In the economic optimization, we have only 10 tons. When we have carbon as an additional objective function, we have 5 tons more. Under economic optimization, eucalyptus dominates, but interestingly, we still have a mixed forest. While when we have carbon as an objective, chestnut is dominating and eucalyptus is only a minor fraction. However, I would like to draw your attention on the economics. So the soil expectation value is negative when we would like to have more carbon, while it is still positive under the economic optimization. So we still have to elaborate on these results, and then we hope that we can have a nice common publication about these topics. So the limitations of this robust optimization. In another project, I carried out Monte Carlo simulations about the impact of climate change and extreme events on the soil expectation value, considering really very huge uncertainty and also situations like the drought in Central Europe in 2018. And we see that the box size here, which we used for the optimization, is from here to here, while we also have soil expectation values which are smaller. So we have observations out of the box. And we still to check how robust the solutions are when we consider these extremely negative values. So these are so far not considered. The next is that we so far cannot really consider the resilience of the ecosystems. So after a strong disturbance, how quickly they would recover. And we are also not able to deal properly with non-linearities because the robust models are always exact models, LPs or second order cone problems, which are not able to integrate non-linearities. So what I mean is, so if we talk about continuous cover forests, then we always have regeneration in the forests. And after disturbance, we might still have this regeneration, while in the clear filling system, we don't have any regeneration. So we expect that the recovery of ecosystem services is quicker after a very severe disturbance in these heterogeneous forests compared to the monostructured forests. So this is so far also not considered, and maybe the robust optimization cannot consider this at all. So the conclusions, if we want to introduce ecosystem services into economic decision making, we require plausible prices for the landowners if they are to provide these services. Robust optimization can help us with this. It's quite attractive method to deal with future uncertainty, can be expanded to multiple objectives, can lead to unexpected insights. So these high costs were really surprising for me. Future challenges are integration of extreme events, resilience, and non-linearities, but that is only some examples, so can even be more challenges. So I hope that maybe making this technique more attractive, there can be light at the end of the tunnel. And yeah, I hope you liked the presentation, although a little bit theoretic. And yeah, with this, I thank you for your attention.
And I would open now the floor to questions by the audience or to questions that may be posted into the chat.
So it appears that I have shocked everybody. So sorry for that.
Thomas, you didn't shock. You addressed these limitations that I've laid out. So uncertainty issues are very important to be addressed by different methods and tools. So perfectly done on that issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, Logan, please.
I have a question that maybe I should already know the answer. Sorry. Hello. I have a question maybe I should already know the answer to, but I'm curious in this ESA tool collaboration. I think you guys consider just the economic variable and carbon storage. And I was wondering how come you did try to incorporate this, I think for the Bio Ecosis Project, that it's like fire vulnerabilities for climate science to each like sand or sand or something like that. I was just wondering if you consider including this additional objective, and if not, there was like any specific reason you were just going for simplicity. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Logan, for the question. I could understand only some fragments, so I'm uncertain about the question, but I think it was about how we can integrate risks like fire, for example. So I think we can do this so far only on a very basic level, because the fire would just enhance the variation of the possible results. And then we can say, okay, we make a box which considers also this variation caused by fire. But that maybe after a fire, depending on the status of the forest, you can lose everything. So then we would have to make very, very large boxes. So far, I think these really stand destroying risks are, I think, not technically so easy to integrate in this robust optimization. But I don't know whether this at all was your question, but we can discuss it also here because Logan is a new team member. So we have already good contact.
Thank you. I would just add that, for example, in the case of the wildfire index, we are considering not the full landscape, but we are considering, when estimating the value of the indicator, the impact of neighboring stands. So we are working with a neighborhood effect, which is something we did not consider in this exercise of cooperation with TUM. So that's something we may want to explore at a later stage, but we work with indicators that we could measure on a per hectare basis, and ignoring the spatial interrelationships between decisions that may be made with different species. Thank you. So is there any other question? Jens, please.
Related to the presentation of farmer, the model that you are using is that have you tried, is something used by planners, or who are actually using the model, or is it not? Is it only to be used for researchers to give some general guidelines, or is it expected to be used by forest managers and forest planners?
Yeah, also here, I'm not sure whether I got the question. I just caught the guidelines word. So of course, guidelines would, here this approach would allow us to make some guidelines depending on the objectives considered. So when we would use only the economic perspective, we can summarize that we should have a mixture of tree species. We should also initiate the regeneration process quite early, so at age 40 to 50, which is early for the German conditions, and we should not accumulate a high amount of standing timber in the forest. So the maximum amount under this alternative management of timber was 100 cubic meters less compared to the Clearfield system. So that would be some general guidelines, maybe to have a robust forests when we would maybe give them to the forest owners. But sorry for not being better in understanding the questions. So was that the question? I'm not sure.
Thanks, Thomas. So is there any other question? Well, if not, thanks again, Harold and Thomas, for your very interesting contributions and your participation. And I would now tell something about the organization. So we'll have a coffee break now. And then we should be back at 11 for a talk by Jens Aulitrup and Jordy, as well as Shandor from the University of Washington. Okay, so thanks again for your participation in this first session.
How do I change the...
É só clicar depois ali o apontador. Vai. Exatamente.
Já estão ligados, por exemplo. Vou carregar no meio. Não sei se está. Já está ligado o computador. Está uma cozinha aberta?
Não. Está aqui o microfone?
Não. Aqui o apontador. É carregar só no meio. Ok. Agora já está. Eu ia dizer só, estes microfones são os do Zoom. Assim estão ligados para o Zoom. E estes aqui são só para a sala. Portanto, quando se quiser dirigir aos dois,
Carregue os dois.
Sim, este aqui.
Okay, so welcome back to our conference. And we are starting now our second session where we'll have talks by Jens, Jordy and Chandor. And we will start then, I'll give you the floor to Jens Albitrup from INRE. Thank you, Jens, for being available to participate in our conference. And I'll give you now the floor, please.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this interesting workshop. You hear me? Okay, that's good. As the title say, I will talk about the potential and the challenges related to paying forest owners for environmental services. I will have 3 parts in my presentation. First, I will talk a little bit about why is that an interesting issue. Then I will talk about the potentials, and this I will do not based on scientific research, but more what I see observe in the field, in Denmark or in France. I'm actually Danish background. This is why I also use the Danish cases that I know relatively well. And then I will talk about some challenges based on some of the projects I have been involved in. So why is this an important issue? And I think I don't have to explain to you, but there is an increasing demand for environmental services from forest service besides timber production. And I think especially with the Green Deal in Europe, that there is an emphasis on the forest to contribute to climate mitigation and also to halt biodiversity degradation. So forest has an important role to play, or it could be, as on the photo on the right side, where we have a water protection forest that is planted on very fertile agricultural land in Denmark to protect against the pesticide contamination of groundwater. And it's cost very much, but it's considered shown that forestry was the most competitive option to protect groundwater against pesticide contamination. So I'm an economist, and I will have an economist perspective of this issue. And first, I want to emphasize one thing that sometimes make a little bit of confusion. When we talk about introducing new markets or paying for environmental services, you can have 2 perspectives as an economist. You can look at it as a business perspective that, as a forest owner or manager, you can have more profit by starting to sell new products on new markets. So it's about increasing profit. Or you can look at it as a policy instrument. How can creating a new market where forest owners are paid for environmental services help to make forest management in accordance with the preferences of the society, of the consumer? So it's looked like another instrument like forest law or a tax or something like that. Actually, what I will talk about, the issues I will talk about apply to both situations, but it's good to have in mind that you can have 2 perspectives from economics on payment for environmental services. So just again to say why it's important because it's already something that takes place. I took from a recent paper in Journal of Ecosystem Services where they have tried to estimate the payment to private forest owners in the US during the last more than 10 years. And you can see that it's increasing. This is on the graph, the bars, the green bars. This is the total amount paid to private forest owners for service that is not timber or non-timber products. And I have to say that the most important, this is the pink curve. This is payment for wildlife. This is actually a lot of hunting license that is in this group. Just information. And one can ask, who is actually paying the private forest owners for these services? And they have also estimated that, and there is a part that comes from the public. This is the smallest part. And then there is compliance. This is basically then companies has to do some kind of ecological compensation or offsets. They pay forest owners to do something in the forest. And then there's these voluntary payments that exclude hunting fees, but also other things. So they estimate for an average private forest land in the US the payment per year per hectare is $18. So I think there is an issue here from an economic point of view. So again, I want to emphasize there is and society has a demand for this non-market ecosystem services or environmental services from the forest. I'll just take an example, the French forest. In the public forest in France, there is free access, but not necessarily in private forest. Private forest owners can close the forest and say they don't want to have visitors in the forest. But surveys shows that actually 85% of the forest owner let people go into the forest. They do not restrict them to go there. And this is important because 72% of the forest in France is owned by private people. We know also that in average, an adult individual in France visits the forest 22 times per year. Of course, there's a big variability. There's 25% who do not visit the forest at all during a year, but there's some people who go very often, maybe because they live very close to the forest. But in France, there's no entry fee because the private forest owners, they just let people enter into the forest. But this does not mean that there is not a value here, that there is not a willingness to pay to have access to forest. And when we use our standard environmental valuation methods, for example, the travel cost methods, we have just recently made an assessment that says that the total willingness to pay per year, aggregate for all the French population, is between 16 and 35 billion euros per year. So what does that represent? It represents that what would they pay to have access to forest? Alternative is that they have no access to forest in France. So it's a little bit hypothetical situation, this amount, but just to make a comparison, for timber, the total sales value of timber in France is about 3 billion euros. So it says something, there is a demand for environmental services from forest. So I just have one slide from a little bit economic perspective. Why is it interesting? Why are we talking about making payment for ecosystem environmental services? It's basically because at the moment, because forest owners do get no money from all these people who actually have a willingness to pay to go to the forest, but they don't get any payment. Why is this actually the case? And how we normally will interpret that as economists is that there is no clearly defined property rights. So this is why forest owners are not selling this service. Of course, if you go to Scandinavian countries, there is everyone has the right to go in private land. So the forest owner do not have the property rights. So he cannot sell entry fees because he's not owning the right in his forest. But in France, basically, the private forest owner could make a fence around his forest and stand outside to sell a ticket to go into his forest. He's allowed to do that, but they do not do. And why do they not do that? It's of course because the transaction cost is too high. To enforce the property right would cost too much to make a fence around or stand outside selling tickets. You know, if I start to do that, the visitor can just go to the neighbor because he's maybe not selling the right to go to his forest. So why should I go to pay for going to a forest, etc. So what my talk is about is some of these perspectives. How could we imagine that maybe by innovation, we could make people pay, the consumers of services, pay forest owners for this service that is not on the market today. So now I go to my second part of my presentation. It's about the potential that is based on some examples that we can observe what takes place today. So who is the potential buyer of these services from the forest that is not on the market today? It could be the public, the states that finance these services. We see that often related to afforestation programs in different countries that the state go in and finance that, but we do not see so much payment for changes in management. Somehow with Nature 2000, we see that in France, but otherwise we don't see really public money. But very recently with the reactivation of the economy after the COVID, where the European countries borrowed a lot of money together. So now they have a lot of investment money for the government to distribute to different sectors, and the forest did also get some money. And there they have made a fund where private forest owners can ask money to help to convert the degraded forest, for example, bark beetles or climate-related degradation, to make more robust forest for the future. And there is 150 million euros put aside for these objectives. And there, in this program, it's explicitly indicated that it's not about producing timber alone. It is also that, but it's also about sustaining the provision of other services, for example, the carbon storage. Other buyers could be private donations. When I was preparing this presentation last week, there was a headline in the Danish national news that saying that private donations to forests are exploding. And there is in Denmark a private nature foundation that collect money and establish new forests or make nature projects, but they have something what they call forest certificate. So if you pay money, you get a certificate that say that you have contributed to plant this forest and things like that. And during the last 4 years, it has really been increasing the number of these donations. Okay, so this is an example. Another example of private donations that come from France. In France, actually, we have, I would say, plenty of some new firms, startups that serve as intermediary function between donators and forest owners. So they collect money, crowdfunding, and they make projects in the forest. And I will give you an example of these. This is Reforest Action. You can go to the homepage, that's in English version. You can go on the site and find a forest project you want to support. There is a map, you can zoom in and find the project. And you can see that they have already planted 14 million trees. And it's a company with 10 full-time employees that only do this kind of thing, handling crowdfunding. One example of a project is close to Paris, I remember, where they has a forest stand with ash trees that is ill of some diseases. So they give money to the forest owner to restore this forest, to plant new trees. So the sick tree will be cut and a new tree will be planted. And it costs €3 per tree to plant. So you can decide, I want to give one tree to this forest. And when you have done that, you can get a small remark on if you want, on the homepage that you have actually contributed to this. So sometimes it's one who give us a gift for birthday. We don't know what to give a tree. Okay. So who should buy? Again, another example, it will come from Denmark, is what I would call private and public partnerships. The government has this year introduced a new law where they have established what they call the Danish Climate Forest Fund. This is, they give 13 million euros from the state to actually make a new forest. This has basically a climate objective, so it's for carbon, but it has also other objectives. But the idea is also that it's open for private donations, and especially from firms. And therefore, they are now developing procedures that can document the impact of carbon and how it's monitored and calculated, so that firms can use that in the green accounting, so they can say, I'm carbon neutral because I have established the forest through the Danish Climate Forest Fund. Yeah. The idea of this fund is that it is actually the landowner keep the ownership of the forest, but it is the fund and they contractors that will actually plant the trees and do the management in the first years. So now we have talked about the buyers, potential buyers. Are there sellers? Are forest owners interested in selling these services? And we made a survey in the Noble project that some is involved here also. In France, we asked 220 private forest owners what they think about the statement. I am open to innovations and new markets. And you can see that more than 50% said that I totally agree. Okay, one can ask, what does it cost me not to say I'm open? Most people will say open. But we also asked them, how do you, I'm attentive to the expectation of the industry, and do they agree in this? And less people was actually agreeing in this. So, and then we have other questions in this questionnaire, and that generally show that these forest owners were relatively open. It has to say that they are not representative of the forest owners in France. They're a little bit bigger than what you have in average. Another way to look for sellers, this is also an example from France. The state-funded extension service, CNPF, they have a platform. You can go to the homepage, and there they present potential projects by private forest owners that they want to find donators that will help to implement these projects. It's mainly about conversion of coppice forest to high forest. It's about restoration of degraded forest for some reason, like the other one we saw about ash trees, or it could be about afforestation. You can see the black dot on the map. It's actually a project that has already been implemented. The different colors, different types of projects. So if you are a company who searches a project, you go there and see what fit to me, is one close to me, or things like that. And 25 of them has been certified by a new carbon project label in France. And I will come back to that on the next slide. So this means that the carbon effect is somehow documented and certified, but I will talk about that now. Because we are talking now about the buyers and the sellers, and I will talk the last slide about the new institutions that can support these new markets. And one such kind of institution in broad sense is a label. And in France, it's called the Label Bas Carbone, low carbon label, I think it's English. And the idea is there that a project that reduces carbon emission can get a certificate and documentation how many tons of carbon per year is actually removed by this project. And the idea, this is the French government that has supported this label, and the procedure has been to develop some kind of methodologies that document how you calculate the reduction in carbon emission. And actually, in the beginning, it was only forest projects that we're talking about. Today, it's opened up also agriculture and other types of sectors can be methodologies. But the first methodologies was about conversion of coppice forest to high forest, afforestation projects, and restoration of degraded forest. And now you have some documents that describe how such a project should be documented, how it should be audited, also how people should monitor that actually take place as it should be. And if they follow this one, they send it to someone to evaluate, and then you can get a stamp and say, yes, you have 100 tons of carbon per year for this project. And also when the forest projects, they only focus on carbon, but they always have a qualitative description of other services like the impact on biodiversity, habitats, and recreation, and water protection, and things like that. But it's not very. There's 152 projects at the moment during these 3 years what has started that has got the label. Not all of them are financed yet. They are still searching donators. Okay, I go to my last part of the presentation. I will talk about the challenges, and I will focus on 3 challenges: asymmetric information, quantification of services, and additionality. I will talk relatively brief about it, but there's also other challenges that we could talk about, but I think there's plenty of good review papers in the literature that discuss different aspects, like with the ecosystem model of forest models. You can have a trade-off between a simple and complex model, and the same in the market mechanism for ecosystem services. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. 5 minutes, okay. So about asymmetric information, I will explain what I mean by this by a case study we did in Denmark. We interviewed 45 water utilities. This is the companies that provide drinking water to municipalities and to the Danish consumers. In 98, there was a new law that made open that these utilities could put a fee on the water price, and this money will go to pay landowners to change management to protect the water resources. So 10 years later, we wanted to see how did this work? Did this be a voluntary agreement with landowners about changing management? Or it has to say it has to be on voluntary basis. So it's really in the payment for ecosystem services or environmental services context. So we saw that it's really now they really want to implement pests function market in Denmark. But actually, there was only about 18 water services out of the 45 that we interviewed that has implemented, had tried to make individual contracts. And what we found out that what was special was that, I will go to the first line in the table. The objective was to make these voluntary agreements, individual negotiated. But actually, many water service experienced that they never succeeded to have an agreement. They started to negotiate. They negotiated for years with landowners, but in the end, they didn't get a contract, or many were still in negotiation when we were talking with them. And why was this the case that it was so difficult? And some water service gave up this individual negotiation with landowners. It was too complicated, too costly in transaction cost. So they went to do some flat rates schemes instead of. So the problem and what we understood from the interviews is that the issue was that the idea was actually in the beginning that the university has developed a cost assessment tool that could very specific say what is the cost of providing groundwater protection on this specific area, taking into account how the farmer was managing his land. But the farmer was never trusting this result and saying, no, my situation is really, really different. I'm a very good farmer. I have very high yields, or I'm very efficient. So my loss opportunity cost of stopping to do intensive agriculture is very costly for me. And it was difficult to make agreements, because for a water utility, it's difficult to say, yeah, you are not a good farmer or something like that. And they experienced also that when they were negotiating, when they're almost having a contract, then the farmer came and said, oh, no, I use actually more compensation because it's actually more expensive for me that. And this is an example of asymmetric information, because basically, yeah, it's the farmer who knows what is the real cost of doing changes. It's not the utility. But of course, he can use this information strategically. And the water service said, we cannot allow ourselves to overcompensate too much these owners, because the consumers of the water will be angry at us if it go out to the media. And even though that the water service said that, yeah, we could actually pay them this what they demand, because still it is the cheapest option for us to pay them, but from some other reasons we don't want to do that. So, and this is a problem that will come again in forestry if you do individual contracts. How should you actually, it's difficult to agree on what is the real cost, because there's asymmetric information. And I will not go into this, but there's some you can start to do flat rate scheme. But this is the problem here. If the change in land use has to be very spatially targeted, you know, the landowner knows that he has a monopoly. He can just put up the price, because you cannot go to another farmer to get the same service. Then I think this slide was actually, I think, a little bit of provocation at this seminar, because there's a lot of thing about how to quantify services. And I will propose that there is a missing link between the complex ecosystem models and what we need in a market reality. Also, how can we make documentation of provision of ecosystem services, for example, carbon, in an operational way that is not too costly, that everyone trusts about. And this is complex. I don't have a solution, but I think there is a problem. So how do they do with the label bas carbone, the label? They have actually extremely simple way of doing it. They use all the production tables, and they use some conversion factors and things like that. If you plant this trees of this beech tree, you have a production table that somehow looks like this area, and then you calculate what is the storage of carbon. So it's extremely simple what they do. And to account for this simplification, they estimate the expected carbon storage, and then they make a discount to account for the uncertainty that they are not doing it correctly. So you can say that the better models you have, you get actually higher compensations. And then this was just to make a joke to put, because actually quantification of the services is important for these startups, the companies that serve as intermediaries. This is again the example of Reforest Action, the one that collect money to plant trees on different projects. On this project I showed before with ash trees, they actually calculate different services, and you can see this little bit symbolic. Health services is actually a calculation of how much oxygen that is produced by the trees. And I don't know, this is normally not how we calculate health effects and things like that. So there is actually a demand for documentation of the other services than carbon. So there is a work to do. And the last slide I have is about additionality. I think the last word is not said about that. We know that if a payment to a forest owner does not change the provision of the service, then it's not additional. And then it's not cost efficient because you get nothing for the money that you use. And it's not, cost effective, I would say. However, there's forest owners that they actually provide high level of other service that is not marketed, even though they are not paid. This can be because the soil and climate do that actually providing these services is the optimal for him to do, also from a profit point of view. Or it could be because the forest owner herself is benefiting from the amenities that is provided, the services. So for them, it's optimal to provide this high level. But there's also some cases where forest owners feel a responsibility for the society. They decide to manage the forest in a way that is corresponding to the demand from the society to be a good citizen, pro-social behavior. And this is driven by some intrinsic motivations. And if you start to pay forest owners for changing management to provide the services, then some of these people who do it by themselves now can say, can lose the intrinsic motivations to do, because now we turn it into not something that is a moral obligation, but something that is a business issue. And then they don't have these motivations to do it anymore. So I think there is some problems that we have to solve. And a thing related to this is that an experience we had from our stakeholder when we discussed stakeholders about new markets for forest environmental services. They said that felt not it was fair that, for example, we pay forest owners that has a degraded Norway spruce stand because they have planted on lowlands where Norway spruce should normally not be, but they're now degraded of bark bills. But they have actually earned a lot of money of fast-growing species. But now they get compensation to regenerate the forest, while the one who kept the mixed species stand that is adapted to the location will get no help to do a regeneration of his forest. And some forest owners think that this is not fair. And then we will be opposed, they will not accept such kind of a mechanism that somehow recompensate the bad guys. So I could talk more about this, but I will finish now. So I think there's a big potential, and this is because we see that it's going on already in different forms. It's just as research, so we try to follow what is actually going on in the field, and it's very interesting. And we don't have an assessment in France, in Europe, like in the US, how much is actually paid to forest owners. I think there's a lot of things to do. I think there's a lot of challenges. I think there is some challenges how to make these ecosystem service models applicable in a market situation so that some startup can start to use this model to document what is the impact of the project they are doing. And but I think there could be some issues about the new technology online and things that could help to facilitate also that there will be less transaction cost in the future for making this new market, because it's mainly transaction costs that reduce the success of these new markets. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jens, for this interesting talk on how to consider and address these payments for ecosystem services to private forest landowners. So We'll have at the end a session for questions and answers, and I would now give the floor to Jordy Garcia Gonzalo from CTSC. We'll be focusing on tools to support forest management planning, considering multiple ecosystem services. So thanks, Jordy, for joining us, and welcome.
Yeah, hello. So I'm trying to share the screen now. I think it should be that one. So I'm not sure. Can you see the screen? The presentation?
Yes, yes, it's fine.
Okay. So I'm gonna try to put this away. Okay, I'm using two screens. I'm not sure. Okay, so thank you. My name is Jordy Garcia. I'm working at the Forest Science and Technology Center of Catalonia. I thank you for the invitation to participate in this workshop conference, and it's a pity that I could not travel, but this pandemic situation has been difficult for everyone, I think. So I'm going to start now the presentation. The title of that one is Innovative Tools to Support Forest Management Considering Multiple Ecosystem Services. And well, I'm going to start with a short introduction about why we need this kind of tools. And then I'm going to present three different tools that we have been developing in our institution. And they provide answers to different questions. So I'm going to try to explain why we need these different tools. So the introduction. Why do we need decision support tools for forest planning? Well, historically, the forests have been managed mainly for wood production, and part of the forest even it has been unmanaged. And now we know that the society it's increasing the demand for other services and functions. And in our context, in the Mediterranean countries, the forests provide multiple functions and services. We can say that nature conservation, recreation, protection against erosion, provision of water resources, etc. So we also know that some of these ecosystem services and functions compete among them. So some of them they have synergies, but some of them they compete. So if we try to provide one service, we are decreasing the level of the provision of another. And this for that we need tools to predict what happens in the future if we do some specific management or under different climate scenarios. So we need these kind of tools to predict what will happen. So I'm going to provide three definitions because I'm going to be using this language, this growth model, simulators, decision support tools. So I took there are many different interpretations of what is a decision support system, but anyway, I'm going to give my interpretation. So a growth model, it's a dynamic representation of the forest and its behavior. And it's basically it's a set of equations that predict something. It can be recruitment of new trees, it can be mortality, diameter increase, height increase, etc. But it's a set of equations. The simulator, it's already a computer tool that based on the set of forest models, these equations, it can make long-term predictions of the status of the forest under certain scenarios of climate, management, etc. And then a decision support system, it provides support to solve problems. It's not only a simulator, it doesn't only simulate the future of the forest and the provision of ecosystem services, but it also provides some decision support. So what can we do with these kind of tools? So what can we do with a simulator? We can check the outputs from a specific prescription. We can do a scenario analysis. We can especially answer questions like what happens if I do certain policy? What happens if I project this climate change scenario, and so on. The thing is that there are some answers that there are some questions that it can not be answered with this kind of tools, or it would be very, very difficult to answer. So, for example, what is the optimal prescription for a stand? Or what is the optimal plan for a whole landscape? Or what is the optimal plan for a landscape, including even flow constraints and so on? So, of course, this I'm not saying that the decision support system is better than others. So what I say is that different tools provide different answers. So, and the selected tool will depend on the question to be addressed. So now I'm gonna present these 3 different tools that we have developed. One is the scenario analyst. It's a regional or national simulator. It's a demand-driven simulator. Then we have another tool that it's TAC4. It's for tactical planning. It's a landscape planning decision support tool. And finally, a multi-criteria decision support tool for spatial planning. So the first one, it's a demand-driven simulator. So we have developed this simulator to use the National Forest Inventory. It's oriented to analyze demand scenarios. So what happens if we increase the demand for timber in the next years? What happens? Can we satisfy the demand of timber if the climate changes? And this kind of questions. Sorry. So the motivation for this, to develop this tool and the models included in this tool, is that we need tools to predict the evolution of the forest and the corresponding provision of goods and services. And we know that there was a lack of climate sensitive individual tree growth and yield models. And we need it, there is a need for projecting forest dynamics as a function of management strategies and climate conditions. And also we have a good set of information. We have the National Forest Inventory, which includes permanent plots that are remeasured every certain time. So this is a good basis to be able to develop models. So as I said, the first step was to develop a full set of climate sensitive individual tree growth and yield models. So for that, we use the permanent plots of 3 different of the second, third, and fourth national inventory. In total, we used more than 70,000 plots for that. And after, we also developed linking functions, which allow us to predict other ecosystem services based on the structure of the forest. So as any model, the explanatory variables relate the structure of the forest, the competition and growth. And then in addition to the forest structure variables, we have the environmental explanatory variables that it can be static or dynamic. The static ones are the ones related to elevation, slope, potential radiation, etc. And then the dynamic are related to the climate, its temperature, precipitation, and so on. So the models developed were the diameter and height increment models, survival models, local ingrowth, and then the ecosystem services that linking functions that we developed. It was carbon stocks, erosion potential, blue and green water, some indicators for recreation, fire risk reduction, mushroom production, biodiversity, and etc. So now we are also working on an indicator for flood risk and also some social indicators. Just to say that this projection system has been developed in R, and there will be a free available R package in the next months, available for anyone that wants to download it and use it. The system includes all the set of models that we developed based on this National Forest Inventory. As I said before, it's a demand-driven simulator. So we have to set the demand levels for timber, and this can be done by species and also for the different regions in Spain, because we know that the demand is different depending on the region and so on. So we also need to input the management rules, and then we set the management rules, and then we proceed for the projects. So I'm gonna explain briefly how it works. So at the beginning, the algorithm classifies all the plots depending on if they will be managed or will be unmanaged, and we set the demand levels for the species and provinces, and we set the management rules. Then for each simulation step, the stands or the plots are ranked, and they are ranked according to the distance to a hard-breaking curve that provides the information to do the thinnings, or they are also ranked according to the distance to the diameter objectives for the final cuts. So once this ranking has been done, the system starts to harvest the plots until the demand for the timber in that period is achieved. Once the demand is achieved, then a simulation period is calculated, and then for the next period, again, all the plots are ranked according to the parameters that we defined, and then harvests start to occur until the demand is fulfilled. Then again, another step, and so on. And this is done up to the end of the planning period. So I'm gonna show just an example. We ran this simulator for Catalonia, and for that we used a set of climate scenarios. So we selected 2 climate change scenarios, and here you can see some figures about the evolution of the temperature, precipitation, and so on for these 2. And then we used 3 simplified management scenarios. One was the business as usual, and then we defined a climate smart forestry scenario, which it's simulating a progressive increase of management, changing some prescriptions and shifting from the products that are used now and shifting to products related to construction, so that it's sequestering the carbon during more time. And then the other scenario was just to increase the harvest levels based on the business as usual, but just making increasing the demand. So here you can see some of how the results looked. So we have different curves for the volume standing, the volume variation, the stand growth, and so on, for the 2 climate scenarios and for the 3 different managements. Here I just show these graphs, but we can analyze what happens in the provision of all the ecosystem services that I mentioned before. So this tool can be used just to see what happens in the provision of the ecosystem services if we change a certain policy. So if we decide to increase the harvest levels in the whole Spain, what will happen to the provision of ecosystem services, how they will vary. We can answer questions as, for example, is it possible to increase the harvest levels by 20% in the next 100 years? So with these simulations, you can answer these questions. So the next steps for this specific simulator, we want to incorporate land use changes. We want to include the interaction between the climate change and the frequency and intensity of fires. And also, we want to include the timber demand by products, not only by the dimension of the trees harvested, but also by the final product. And so in these three things we are already working, and now we also have like future expectations that just to improve the system, like explore the inclusion of interaction between climate and competition in the mortality models, explore alternative statistical approaches for ingrowth, allowing to calculate the decomposition rates on snags and stumps, or accounting for other perturbations different than fires, and including other aspects of the forest value chain. So the next tool that I'm going to explain is developing a management-driven decision support system. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we need different type of simulators if we want to optimize forest management at landscape level, or if we want to obtain the trade-offs among different ecosystem services. So at the forest level, the objective is to find the best combination of management alternatives for the whole landscape in order to maximize certain objective or objectives. This is a combinatorial problem, and for that we need some operation research techniques. So in addition to that, in order to improve the acceptance of the forest plans, or in order to favor participatory the participation of different stakeholders in the planning process, we need to develop some visualization techniques. So that's the motivation for the next tool that we developed. And what we have done is a modular decision support system, which here you can see the different modules that are included. One is a management information module with a database for a georeference database for the inventory data, a database for costs and prices of the different operations, and then a place to store the output of the simulations. Then we have the simulation module itself, which includes a prescription generator where you generate the different management rules, and the growth and yield simulator, which includes the set of models that we developed in the previous one. Then the optimization module and the visualization tool. So as I said, here we have a georeference database and then a GIS, which is where you can see the information, the inventory data, etc. The simulation module, basically what we did is just to take all the equations from previous system and use them here in a different way. The simulation algorithm, instead of being demand driven, it's a management driven, which means that for each unit or plot that you introduce in the system, a set of management alternatives are simulated. All these management alternatives are simulated for each unit, and then this will provide the decision space for the next module. Then here we have this optimization module, and basically what it does is it reads all the information from the simulation. So we have a huge list of data where for each unit we have all the outputs for all the management alternatives defined. And then this is transformed in a mathematical model where you have to define what is your objective function. This objective function, as I said, it can be a combination of different objectives. So it can be one objective function as maximize timber production, for example, or it can be the maximization of different ones. Then, once you have this mathematical model, we are using an external tool to visualize the interactive decision maps, where you can see the Pareto frontiers, which show the trade-offs between different objectives. And this tool allows the user to select different alternative plans depending on the level of the provision of the different, let's say, objectives or criteria. So here, this allows you to interpret different ecosystem services. So you can have timber, as I said at the beginning, you can have the timber, the erosion, the carbon sequestration, and so on. And you can analyze what happens if you try to improve one objective against another. And then you can select a specific point in the Pareto frontier which corresponds to a specific management plan. So this tool, in the context of Novel, we are using this tool to select few different management plans that provide different level of ecosystem services. And then these 3 or 4 selected plans go later to an auction, where the people participating in the auction decide which one of the plans will be accepted, and then it will be implemented. So in the next steps that we are working in this decision support system, it's to link this growth, is to link the growth and yield models with a fire spread simulator. So we want to have all the outputs for a specific management alternatives, where you have the data of the structure of the stands, and then we want to link this to a fire spread simulator to see how the fire would affect if there is a fire in this. And then now I'm going to explain the third decision support tool, which is a decision support for landscape level analysis. So this is basically a tool for spatial problems, and we use multi-criteria analysis for that. It's easy to use, and it allows you to combine quantitative and qualitative data with expert knowledge. It has a module just to read the data, and then it has a second module that is that data management system. It's able to do some queries, filtering, analyzing the data, and so on. And then the third module that has here is it's an interactive tool to convert the units of a certain layer to sub-utilities. So this allows you to have this expert knowledge that here you define for a specific layer of information how much utility it provides. For example, if we are talking about fires and we are analyzing the fuel load in the system, we can say it's not if there is fuel in the forest, we have a fire risk. If we don't have fuel, you don't have fire risk, but you have a gradation. You have values from 0 to 1, and according to the expert, you can say that if this amount of fuel is higher than this value, then the utility it's 0.7, for example. So you can have this kind of data. So this tool it has the capacity to generate a map of different of the priorities depending on the relation among the variables and the weights that you give to them. So you can, this is like a kind of geographic information system where we can have several layers of information, but then this information you can assign different weights to each of the layers. So you can say that, for example, a layer of the fuel, it has more weight in the final map than the layer of the villages in the landscape. So you can consider multiple layers of information, but then you select which the weight you give to each one. So as an example of use of this tool, we use it in Catalonia to select the strategic supporting suppression areas. So when we talk to the experts on fire risk, they told us that they need a tool where they can combine different layers of information, and they told us which information they want to use, like vegetation, weather information, topography, and then based on this information you can derive the fuel characteristics, the fire behavior, and so on. So after you analyze all this information, you have a potential zone of areas that with a ranking where you have the areas that you must to do interventions in order to reduce the risk, and then from these selected areas, then there is an optimization tool just to select which management alternatives you will apply in order to reduce the fire risk. So as an example here, we have the layers of the fuels, the exposition, the fire behavior, the suppression infrastructures, and the continuity of the landscape. And then at the end, we have a map of these priority areas. After that, once you have these priority areas to treat, we have to provide potential actions to implement in the landscape. For these actions, you have the costs associated to them, and also you have the impact of each action on the fire potential. So basically with that, you have all the information for the optimization model, where at the end it will select for each unit in the landscape which potential action should be implemented in order to reduce this fire risk. So, and these were the 3 tools that we developed, and as I said at the beginning, they are used to answer different questions, and one is more strategic for regional and national context. The other is more to landscape level, where you can analyze these trade-offs among different ecosystem services, and it provides a good tool for later analyzing this payment for ecosystem services. And then the last one, it's very flexible, and it can be used for many different problems, and you can analyze and combine many different types of information. So thank you.
Thanks, Jordy, for your presentation on these innovative tools developed at CTFC. I would like to remind the participants that are joining us remotely to post in the chat your questions so that we may have and may include them and discuss them at the end of this session. So thanks, Jordy, again. And I would now give the floor to Shandar Todd, who is joining us from the University of Washington in Seattle. So thanks, Shandar, for being available to participate in this conference and for joining us at this early hour in Washington. I think in Seattle it's 4 a.m. So thanks again for being available to join us at this time. So thanks, Shor, and welcome, Shandar.
Oh, no problem. I actually trained myself a little bit for getting up at 4 in the last couple of days. I decided to go to bed a little bit early and earlier, and so I feel fresh and ready to join the conference. Thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect, loud and clear.
Very good. My name is Shandor Todt. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. And this presentation concerns the impact of climate change on ecosystem services. And in particular, what we try to examine in this study with my former student, Nick Coleman, was how climate change might impact the joint provision of forest ecosystem services, how it might impact the trade-offs and the conflicts between or behind these ecosystem services. And so before I get further into the details, I just want to give credit to Nick, who was a master's student of mine a few years ago. Now he's working for Amazon Transportation Services in Seattle. And this is primarily his work that he performed while he was working in my lab at the University of Washington. So there's a lot of research that had been done in the context of how climate change might affect forest ecosystem services. But little or no study had been documented with regards to how these effects translated to changes in the conflict or the trade-off among these ecosystem services. And I will explain exactly what I mean by that. But the key question that we are going to focus on in the context of this presentation is how to measure the degree of conflict or the severity of trade-offs among various ecosystem services. If we think of, say, climate, if we think about a fire hazard and the mitigation of fire hazard as a potential ecosystem outcome of management on the land, that outcome might be a function of how much old forest habitat we would like to provide, for example, or it might, the amount of habitat that we can provide might also be a function of how much sediment delivery we might want to avoid in a watershed. And so if you think about these ecosystem functions as services, such as providing clear water, i.e. reducing sediment delivery in the water system, or reducing the susceptibility of the landscape to catastrophic fires, or to increase the amount of habitat for sensitive wildlife. The question that we are trying to ask here is how the joint provision of these functions would be affected under different climate scenarios. And in particular, we are going to look at three scenarios. One is when there's no climate change, we assume that nothing is going to change. From this point forward, we call this the baseline scenario. And then we are going, so this would be the dark blue in this chart to the lower right. And we are going to consider a mild and severe alternative, the former of which is in light blue and the latter is in red here, corresponding to two energy levels, E45 and E85, corresponding to RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. But before I tried to show you how we went about analyzing the trade-offs behind these services, I would like to invite you to consider how different suites of alternative management plans, in this case, they could be fuel management plans if we are paying attention to fire risk mitigation, how different alternatives that one can generate using a variety of decision support systems, such as the one that Jordy was talking about earlier. How can that information be used to derive just how much trade-off, just how much conflict there is behind these ecosystem services? So as a way of illustration, let's consider a simple situation here where we have two ecosystem services, ecosystem service one, which is listed here on the horizontal axis, and ecosystem two, which is ecosystem service two, which is listed here on the vertical axis. Both of these services, let's assume that both of these services increase in value on the horizontal axis from the left to the right, and on the vertical axis from the bottom up. And so if you see the blue dots, for example, on this chart, each of these points represent, let's say, a management plan that is projected to provide a bundle of these two services in values that are represented by projections of these points, orthogonal projections of these points to these two axes. So for example, this blue dot here would lead to this much ecosystem service on the horizontal axis and this much on the vertical axis. I don't know if you can see my cursor here. And then another point in this family of solutions, which we call a Pareto set, and I'm sure you heard about that from Jordy or Professor Borges. This other point is also optimal in the sense that it provides an amount of ecosystem service one and an amount of ecosystem service one, neither of which could be improved by changing that management plan without compromising the other one. And so if you look at this set of points, let's say these blue dots represent the Pareto front associated with the management plans under no climate change. And if you compare those to, for example, the red ones, then the question arises, which of these two scenarios is likely to cause more conflict with regards to managing for these ecosystem services? And so that's the question we are trying to ask. And in addition, we also try to measure quantitatively that amount of trade-off, amount of conflict that exists between these. And the reason why we want to do that is because we would like to have a relatively accurate tool at our disposal to analyze these conflicts under different alternative futures with regards to what the climate might do in the Western United States. And so in this presentation, I am going to use a terminology that is aligned with multi-objective optimization. And so I'm just going to go through these key terms just to make sure that we are on the same page as the use of the terms. In this study, we modeled forest ecosystem services as objective functions in a multi-objective optimization model that attempted to generate all alternative management plans with regards to these objective functions, so that none of these solutions would be so-called dominated by other management plans that would provide a better outcome for any or all of these ecosystem services without compromising another service. And so it is in the context of identifying these so-called Pareto frontiers, or some people call them trade-off curves, production possibilities frontiers. So it was in the context of this information that we attempted to measure conflict between these services. Solutions to these multi-objective optimization models were management plans, as I pointed out in the previous slide. And these management plans are represented as points in the space that maps out the ecosystem service achievements. And so the conflict was measured in this space, which we call objective space. And I will use trade-offs and conflicts for the rest of the presentation interchangeably. So the first thing that we wanted to do is to measure conflict in the entire system of ecosystem services, no matter how many we had in our model, whether we had 2, 3, or more than 3 ecosystem services. And the metric that we propose is the so-called hypervolume metric, which represents the area underneath the Pareto frontiers associated with different alternative climate futures with regards to the ecosystem services that we would like to provide and project under these management plans. So if we only had 2 ecosystem services, say habitat provision and wood production, both of which increasing along these axes, then the resulting point set would define an area underneath of themselves that we would like to measure. In 2 dimensions, this is just an area, but in 3 dimensions, it's a volume. And the reason we use the fancy word hypervolume is because we wanted this metric to be useful even when we had more than 3 ecosystem services or 3 objective functions. And so we wanted to create an algorithm that was able to calculate that hypervolume no matter how many ecosystem services we wanted to consider. And so if we look at this chart on the left, the 2-dimensional area with regards to 2 ecosystem services, it is intuitive to suspect that the bigger this blue area, the less conflict there is among these ecosystem services. And that's because the closer these solutions set, the closer this set of management plans are to the ideal solution, which is not attainable if these two ecosystem services compete with each other. The closer this set of points are to the ideal solution, the bigger area they are going to cover in blue. And that also is also true for a three-dimensional or three or more ecosystem services. The closer we can get to the ideal solution in terms of the achievements of these management plans with regards to the ecosystem services, the bigger the volume or hyper volume underneath these points is going to be, meaning less conflict in the system. So this was the first thing that we tried to do, and the algorithm is actually not very simple, especially when we considered ecosystem services in any number. But basically, as you can just imagine, in a two-dimensional projection of what happens when we calculate one management plan, and say the area or hypervolume underneath that point might be this yellowish greenish color. I don't know what color you see on your screen. If we find a second alternative management plan that is also Pareto optimal, we would have to add this square area here. And if we find a third one, then we would have to add this polygon. The calculation of these areas is not very simple, and so one has to run an iterative algorithm, which the pseudocode for which is outlined here. But just to give you an example, what these calculations might look like. In this case, a municipal watershed in the Deschutes National Forest in Oregon, United States. If you see the set of blue management plans in comparison to the set of orange ones and the green ones, we get these three different hypervolume values. For the blue one, we get 0.9. For the orange, we get 0.8. For the green, we get 0.7, indicating that conflict is the most severe under the management plans that are generated for this situation and are listed in green, which is not immediately obvious if we are trying to analyze a chart like this. Now, another question that we were trying to ask, once we knew, for example, that under the green scenario we had a greatest amount of conflict, which objectives, which ecosystem services compete the most among the system of ecosystem services. And so that was our second challenge, is to come up with a metric to measure pairwise objective conflicts. And the way we did that was that we projected the three or higher dimensional Pareto solutions, Pareto optimal management plans, to two-dimensional sections of the space. And for example, in this chart, what we can see is that this is the projection, two-dimensional projection of management plans with regards to objective 1 and objective 2. This would be the set for objective 1 versus objective 3, and this would be the projection for objective 2 and 3. And then we tried to calculate a metric for each of these point clouds. Again, here objectives correspond to ecosystem services, assuming that all of these are maximized. The more is better. And so our metric for pairwise conflict has two components. One just looks at the relative difference, the average distance of the solutions that we found with Pareto optimality from the ideal solution, and compare that distance, that average distance, these yellow rays here, with the maximum distance, which is the distance of the ideal solution to the origin. So we calculated the ratio of that, saying that if this average distance from the ideal solution, the greater that distance is, the smaller, the greater that distance is, the bigger this ratio is going to be, contributing more to the conflict metric that is trying to measure the trade-offs between two objective functions. And the second part, this ratio here of this metric, corresponds to the spread and the ordering of the points within the Pareto set. And so what we try to do here is to represent just to what extent is one objective provisions, to what extent are those provisional levels a monotonous function of the increases in the other objective. So if an ecosystem service, if you try to increase an ecosystem service by a certain amount, would the amount corresponding to the other ecosystem service also increase or go down? And depending on whether there is a monotonous a correlation between the values of those provisions of ecosystem services, or there's a reverse relationship, this row here would take a value of 1, -1, or anywhere in between. And so the greater the contrast, the greater the value of this ratio is going to be, and thus contributing to a higher conflict value for that ecosystem service. And so just to wrap up the first part of this presentation, we tried to measure the conflict between the provision of ecosystem services for the entire system of objective functions representing the provision of these ecosystem services, as well as we were also trying to detect where exactly the conflict originated from within this system. And so what I'm going to do next is just provide an illustration of how we use these two metrics in the context of a municipal watershed near Bend, Oregon. So we are in the Western United States, a fire-prone ecosystem on the eastern side of the Cascades Mountains. And the municipal watershed that we are talking about is actually this smaller area here. It's called, very descriptively, the drink management planning unit. It's about 7,000 acres to the west of the city of Bend. And so this, once again, this is the municipal watershed for the city. The water filters through this watershed. The forest vegetation acts as a filter to provide clean water to the city. And the question is, how should this watershed be managed? There's a picture of what we are looking at. Here are the higher peaks of the Cascades. Here is the forest ecosystem through which water flows to the city, and when we try to identify the main concerns of management within this watershed, again, it's about 7,000 acres. It became clear that in addition to providing clean water, and this is an actual photograph of one of the streams that flows through the system, in addition to the quantity and the quality of water, there's a main federally enforced concern about providing habitat for an endangered species. I'm sure that many of you have heard about this species, the northern spotted owl, which is under threat almost everywhere in the northwestern part of the United States. And the third concern was fire. Although no fire has occurred within the watershed in the last couple of decades, but when it did, the last time in the 1970s, what happened was just a tiny part of this watershed was affected, but that was enough to compromise water quality in this municipal watershed to such an extent that the city had to actually dig wells and import water from elsewhere. Because what happens is that if the forest fire goes through the watershed, it destabilizes the soils, and then once there's a rainfall event, that soil is going to be washed into the water system. And without any further filtration, the end result is going to be higher turbidity, higher sediment in the water that is no longer safe for drinking, unless they set up an artificial filtration system, which is very expensive. So to compound the problem, no management had occurred in this watershed for many decades, and so fuel had been accumulating on this landscape for a long period of time, and so managers were very concerned about the trade-off of introduced by forest fires. And so the trade-off here is really interesting because it also has a temporal dimension. So in the vertical axis, what you see is environmental risk associated with sediment delivery to the water system, and on the horizontal axis you see time. And initial fuel management actions would increase the risk of sediment delivery. So that's what you see in the initial peak of this dotted line. But once those action had been performed, we expect risk to go down in the long term to a lower level than what we would otherwise see on this linear line corresponding to R2. And so that was the trade-off that was part of the trade-off that they wanted to look at is what is the cost of initial action, fuel removals, for example, prescribed burns. What's the cost of that in terms of sediment delivery, both in the short and in the long term? So we had three objectives or three ecosystem services that we looked at in this system. One was water quality, and we used the USDA's online water erosion prediction model called WEP. We also used the modified soil loss equation, as well as sediment delivery ratios calculated with SED-MOD-MOL. We used these models to predict, to the best of our ability, what would happen under different management scenarios, where the management scenarios corresponded to fuel management. And so we calculated sediment delivery 1 year after the fuel treatment, and in year 2 and in year 3. In year 2, we assumed that sediment delivery would be 70% of what we calculated based on these three models in year 1, and in year 3 it would be 50%. So we assumed that it would taper off a little bit over time. With regards to fire hazard, we used the United States Forest Service Forest Vegetation Simulator, FVS, in particular, its fire and fuel extension, as well as its climate variant, to project fuel models, which were then used to calculate the fire hazard metric based on flame length, rate of speed, and total fuel load. And so this is how we were trying to populate our multi-objective optimization model with fire hazard coefficients corresponding to all the different fuel management options that we wanted to consider for this landscape. So the objective was to minimize the area-weighted reductions in hazard ratings relative to no treatment. So I missed the no here. And we validated this protocol using FLAM map simulations. Finally, northern spotted owl habitat was modeled based on information that was provided to us by wildlife biologists who identified northern spotted owl habitat based on the elevation of the site. So they had to be below 1,830 meters, canopy cover over 60%, and presence of big trees, basically. And we also wanted to measure spotted owl habitat only if the patches of habitat that met all three of these criteria were existed in contiguous patches of 200 hectares or more. If they existed in smaller patches, more than 200 hectares, then we discounted their contribution to the habitat objective function by 50%. And finally, we created the model with two 20-year-long planning periods with 303 treatment units or polygons within this 7,000 hectare watershed. And we considered fuel treatment in the first period, in the second period, in both periods, or no treatment at all. And we solved them all with CPLEX and used the weighted objective function method to generate the Pareto set. And now I'm going to switch to show you some of the solutions. Just give me a second here. So when you look at this chart here, you see owl habitat in the vertical axis. The higher values correspond to higher positions on this vertical axis. On one of the horizontal axes, we have fire hazard ratings. A smaller value here corresponds to lower fire hazard. So we improve going from this direction towards here, and then sediment delivery on the second horizontal axis that also goes down as we go from the left to the right. And the three different colors here are corresponding to the three climate scenarios that we considered. One was the baseline no climate change scenario in blue. Orange was the E45, a mild climate change, and E85 in green, which was severe climate change. So as you can see, if there is no climate change, we found management plans in this corner up here, which is where we want to be towards the ideal solution, as much owl habitat as possible, and as little sediment delivery and as little fire hazard as possible. But as climate change was projected to become more severe, we would move from this blue cloud towards orange solutions, and eventually to the green ones if the climate change turned out to be even more severe than that. And so corresponding to these three Pareto sets, we calculated the hypervolume and as you can see here for the baseline scenario, this hypervolume was the greatest, and for the most severe climate change scenario, it was the lowest, telling us, confirming our visual inspection, that conflict under the most severe climate change scenario was the highest. The second thing that we wanted to look at is the pairwise trade-offs. So for example, here we are looking at the trade-off between fire hazard reduction and peak sediment delivery. The sediment delivery increased from, in this case, from left to right, and fire hazard ratings increased from the bottom up. So as you can see here, under no climate change, we are here in the blue section. For mild climate change, we are in orange, and for severe climate change, we are in green. And what's interesting here is that, say, we are up here at a high fire hazard situation under one of the more severe climate scenarios. In order to improve by fuel management fire hazard ratings, you can drop down in this curve without causing too much extra sediment delivery up to a point, after which any even minor improvements, moving from one green point to another green point, or moving from one orange point to another orange point, you would have to compromise in terms of peak sediment delivery. And that's also true for the no climate change scenario as well. Initially, you can improve fire hazard ratings quite a bit, but then your reward per cost of action is going to taper off. But you are at a much, much lower level of fire hazard under no climate change. It's not a big surprise. And so the lesson here is that initially big improvements can be achieved up to a certain point, beyond which it's going to be harder to do that. And these trade-offs are more severe under climate change. The other thing I wanted to show you is that while under no climate change, fire hazard ratings can be reduced quite significantly with no cost to northern spotted owl habitat. So these points are aligned in a roughly vertical spatial configuration. But if you go to the mild and severe climate change situation, you see that these improvements in fire hazard ratings in the orange can be improved only up to a certain point, beyond which you're going to have to compromise all habitat. And especially under the green climate change scenario, spotted owl habitat would have to be reduced by quite significantly, even to achieve a little bit of reduction in fire hazard. So now I'm going back to my slides and wrap up here. So our results you confirmed for this particular illustrative project, for this particular case study, that climate change is going to impact both the individual and the joint provision of ecosystem services. We used various conflict metrics to quantify the degree to which conflict behind these ecosystem services changed. And we found from the demonstration from the case study that these conflicts are going to increase with increased climate change severity in the DRIC management unit in Oregon, United States. However, this this increase in conflict is uneven among the objectives and across the climate scenarios. The watershed has a lot of resiliency up to a certain point, beyond which there's a steep deterioration in spotted owl habitat or in peak sediment delivery. And we have to admit that this nature of conflict would likely be very different in different sites and among other objectives, which is why these kinds of analyses are important. Fire hazard can initially be reduced substantially at little cost to peak sediment or spotted owl habitat, but beyond a certain threshold, steep declines can be expected in both of these ecosystem services. And these are going to be worse with increasing climate change severity. So, so that's all I wanted to say. And just the final note that without climate change, the area of spotted owl habitat remains unaffected regardless of the degree to which we wish to reduce fire hazard. So that's what we saw in our results. And so to wrap up, we would like to emphasize that with the climate change scenarios that are predicted to occur in the future, not only would forest ecosystem services be affected individually, but the joint provision of these services would also be affected in a way that would lead to more conflict between these services. And more conflict between these services could, of course, translate to more conflict in the societal effort to provide these ecosystem services to various stakeholder groups as well. Measuring the rate at which these conflicts increase is important in our opinion, and to our knowledge, no other metrics had been proposed in the past to measure changes in these conflicts. And so we feel that's the main contribution of this project. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Shandor, for your presentation. I would open all the floor. We are past the hour, but for a few questions, I'm not sure if some have been posted in chat for the presentations by Jens, Jordy, and Shandor.
I just want to ask a question. Is from just have one article about this presentation. I want to ask one question. One sentence interested me when it was written there. This approach may be useful in helping stakeholders set targets or wildfire resistance criteria and in providing clearer representation of decision-making problem. I think in here, like they are mentioning about stakeholders as forest owners, private forest owners. But can you explain this better? Like how can we integrate stakeholders by creating this model, this system?
I couldn't really hear the question. Josie, can you repeat it?
Presentation. In order to actually use this content, set the floor decisions about tools, and in there they were mentioning about stakeholders. Like in the further we can participate stakeholders in this process. They are mentioning that. Can you explain better how can we integrate stakeholders to set targets for wildfire resistance?
So if I understand well, the question is when setting up the targets and selecting the plans, how would stakeholders be involved in that process?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a question that may be for either Shandor or Jordy to address.
Yeah, so whenever I work on these projects, in this case with the Deschutes National Forest, we have stakeholder meetings, and so it's an iterative process where we start by identifying management objectives, ecosystem services of concern, and we often end up with dozens of objectives. In the case of the case study that I mentioned in this presentation, we identified fish habitat, recreational objectives, a much higher number of management objectives, a much higher number of ecosystem services than than what was used in the mall. So our next step was to try to consider whether or not any subset of these concerns, any subset of these management objectives would go hand in hand if, for example, we try to reduce sediment delivery in the streams. Would that also improve fish habitat? Because if it would, and of course it would, then those two objectives could be consolidated into one. And so that was the second step in our stakeholder interactions, is to consolidate the set of ecosystem services in the mathematical model, not in terms of reporting the outcomes, just in terms of the mathematical model. We tried to consolidate these services into a smaller and more manageable set for the mathematical model. And then the third step was to generate solutions like the ones I showed in the charts and present them to the stakeholders. And we heard back from them, and they would say, "Oh, we don't think that this is realistic. Maybe there's an issue with your model." And then so we would go back to the model, make adjustments until field foresters, for example, would have confidence in the forest vegetation simulations, for example, to proceed. I'm currently working with the city of Seattle to create a management plan for their 96,000 acre municipal watershed that provides the city with water. And so we have a stakeholder meeting every month. And I constructed my model and presented my decision model to them about a year ago. And we've been iterating since then on a monthly basis in terms of figuring out how to incorporate the 15 main management objectives that they would like to consider. So I think the main point here, to answer the question, is to work very closely for the stakeholders so that they would have a sense of ownership with regards to the model, that we built them all together so that they would trust the solutions that come out of these models. I don't know if Jordy has anything to add to this. Did I answer the question?
Thanks, Shandor. Yeah, so I have just one question for Jens. You discussed the issue, the pros and cons of several approaches to attract payments, namely the symmetry. Here in Nobel, we have been discussing this possibility of using this forward auctioning approach. What do you have a view over how this approach may help address those issues that you talked about, the activity, asymmetry? Thanks.
I think by this kind of internet crowdfunding, I think the reason future options to better document what you are doing and think about on space. So there's a two things, there's the demand side and the supply side. For the supply side, the forest developers provide the parties how to select, how to make the forest owners. I see some of the two things that they work for partnerships, but also they can go together with the forest owners to make. So what's actually follow up the survey I presented years ago when into we have come back to some of the opportunities that have not succeeded in projects where they make contracting with the landowners, and this was done in some kind of landform consolidation projects where actually people who wanted to do intensive management still, they could get the other land where they do that, and then other people to own the land where they wanted to do this. So this is one of the 16 expensive, and this is when it's very targeted in relation to the provision of service. water. And then I think for more broadly, it's not going to be space on targeted provision of services. I think there's many, I think, better way and maybe some kind of, could be something of this crowdfunding combined with the auctions platform that we talk about. I don't know exactly how it has to be built, but I think there is a space for innovation because you can exploit some of this too, because people are already choosing like between different offers of projects that is projects provided. And the users can go on their product, but they're not exploiting this yet, that they can put them side by side to see, okay, this product not more biodiversity than this product, or they need the same carbon. This is not exploiting, but I think there's potential there. But I see sometimes the model that was presented now also by Sander and, you know, there are very complicated things to do, and I'm not sure that this is a startup will start to use this kind of model. So I think there's some need for translation between researchers and the people who are going to settle the contracts. And I don't have the answer.
Okay, thank you so much. So I would like to thank you all, the audience, for being present here. I would like to thank again Shandor and Jordy and Jens for joining us remotely or here in presence, Jens, for this session. And so thanks again, and we will close